Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Gavin Costigan. I'm the Director of Public Policy here at the University of Southampton. This is the first of our training sessions this year on various things to do with public policy. It's great to see so many of you here. As you know, there's some drinks over there and a sheet coming around, so do please sign that if you can. This session is about how to influence and policymakers, but also how to identify and find policymakers. We're all starting in slightly different positions. So I'm going to start from a really simple question. And if anyone is feeling enthusiastic already and wants to play, do feel free to put up your hand. My question is, what is policy? No, that's what I thought would happen. That's usually what happens at the start of a training course. Okay, so I'm going to answer the question, what is policy? We'll then talk a little bit about how to find policymakers and how to influence them. So, you can always rely on the University of Cambridge for a nice definition. That's set out here. It's 4 lines long because that's Cambridge for you. My rather simplistic definition is the one at the bottom. It's decisions about what to do about stuff in different circumstances. But the point about policy is it's making decisions. It's not about having evidence, it's about doing something with that evidence. It's about making decisions. And that will help us to think in our roles how we can contribute to policy. Now, on a really simplistic level, we all know what policy is in our everyday lives. There's a picture of some money in that left-hand picture. I have a teenage daughter. She doesn't get as much money as she would like to live the lifestyle she feels is appropriate to her. She knows the policy maker, she knows the policy decision she wants to make, and she's constantly in active negotiation with that policy maker to try and get a change of policy. So we understand what policy is. If suddenly Southampton General Hospital announced that it was going to close its A&E department and that we'd all have to travel to Bournemouth or to Winchester or somewhere else to get accident and emergency, a lot of people would object to that. They'd know the policy they wanted to change. They'd find out who was responsible for that policy and be wanting to influence it. But that becomes a little bit more complicated when we start from the other side of the equation, when we start from evidence. Policy decisions are often the ones on the board. They're about starting things, or they're about stopping things, or they're about changing things, or they're actively deciding not to start or stop or change something. That's the kind of decisions that people are making all the time in policy, in government. But sometimes when we start from the research side, it can actually be quite difficult to work out what the decision is that relates to the evidence that we've got, the expertise that we're bringing as researchers. And I hear terms like I have policy relevant research, or I have evidence to change policy. And that's absolutely necessary, but it's not enough. Because if you don't know the decision that you want to change, it's very difficult to change it. If you don't know why your research, your evidence is useful to policymakers, it's very hard to then engage them and influence them about it, because they're not going to know. You're going to need to help them understand it. And this chart shows a little bit of the difference between evidence and policy. I picked 4 things on the left-hand side that I know we have real expertise on in this university. Toxicity of substances, link between mental health and homelessness, new developments in drone technology, economic and political developments in China. Now, they're obviously picked to have a wide range of different subject areas. I could put 150 things on this list, all different areas of research expertise. But the point is, the policymakers are on the right-hand side of this chart. They're thinking about regulations, they're thinking about provisions, they're thinking about priorities for diplomatic engagement. And they're only interested in what's on the left-hand side of this when it helps them on the right-hand side. So when we engage them, when we talk to them about the excitement and the interest and the importance of the evidence, we have to do that knowing the context in which they're thinking and explaining to them why that evidence is relevant to the decisions they have to make. And that can be quite hard. You know, it actually can be quite difficult to think, what is it that my research, my evidence is going to help? What are those regulations? Who actually is interested in this, and what particular things are they worried about? And that's a little bit about what we'll be talking over the next hour or so. But you do need to do a little bit of research in that, and not academic research. Think about the different sides of this. Speak to people, get advice from people who've done this before. And if you can't articulate what it is that is important about your evidence to policymakers, then they won't be able to do it either. So there is an emphasis on us, and we can help in the public policy team, but that is the challenge, and it's not straightforward. So this is your first exercise. You should do this with your neighbour, so hopefully everyone has a neighbour, and if not, turn or move so that you have a neighbour. You've got 5 minutes to think about your area of research and to think about what the policy decision might be from that area of research. So what are you researching on, and what possible use could that be in the policy making environment? So meet somebody nice sat next to you. You've got 5 minutes. Okay, that's great. Some great conversations going on, and hopefully you've begun to explore some of the issues. And for some of you, it'll probably be very straightforward. And for others of you, it takes a little bit more teasing out what some of those policy decisions are. So now we know the policy we're trying to influence. What's the next step? We actually have to find policymakers. So where are they? Where do they lurk? How do we get hold of them? So here are some places where they are: UK national government, Parliament, local government, devolved assemblies, international organisations, and of course all of those organisations in other countries. So they're everywhere. But let's talk a little bit about government. Obviously we know what it is. It takes policy decisions, it regulates, it proposes laws, it delivers some services. Within a government department, you've probably heard of all of these kind of names: the Secretary of State, ministers, permanent secretary, very archaic British names. If anyone comes from outside the UK, these are really strange sort of names. All the way down to officials, which is everybody who isn't a minister. The point about this slide actually is, if I asked you which of these people were policymakers, the answer is all of them. All of the people on this slide influence policy, make policy, and depending on what your evidence is and what you're trying to influence will depend on which of these people you want to try and get hold of. But unsurprisingly, it's not that easy to just drop a quick email to a leading politician and a member of the cabinet and say, I've got some cool research, can I come and have a chat? And expect them to respond and say, yeah, great. You know, send me your paper and I'll read it for half an hour and then you can come in. It doesn't work like that. But equally, many of us are working on areas of research that are not actually dealt with very often at the level of politicians, because politicians deal with things that are most expensive or most controversial. And some of you will be working in those areas for sure, but other people will be working in areas that are mainly managed, in any case, by the civil service. And certain issues will go up and down. Sometimes an issue will become very, very relevant because there's a new law going through the House of Parliament, but the rest of the time it's actually not as politically hot. So understanding a little bit about who we're trying to influence and who these people are. But you can influence all of them at different stages, and they're all policymakers. Now, I don't like saying nice things about the government because it doesn't feel right, but one of the actually quite good things about the government is this website, www.gov.uk. When you first open it up, which I'll do in a minute, it has a list of services, which is clearly if you are a member of the public and want to know how to pay your tax or to tax your car or to do various things. That's lovely, but scroll past that and you get all sorts of really helpful information about government departments, about people in them, about the different structures. And this is a beginning to understand who are the people responsible for what you're trying to do, where are they, how can you get hold of them. So I'm going to try and go into this live and see if it works. And if it doesn't, we'll have a different type of presentation. So that's your government website. As I said, the start is all full of nice things, what to do about driving or tax or getting a passport. If we scroll past all of that, you get to this section, much more interesting. So, all government departments, click on government departments briefly. Here they all are. So let's assume we're working on something to do with the environment. We can scroll down to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and click on there. And instantly we get a page that is all about that department. And as you get to know these websites, you can see they tell you the latest news, they tell you the policies and things that they're responsible for. And as you scroll down, you actually see real people's photographs. So these are the ministers responsible. Here is a list of civil servants. Every government department has something called a chief scientific advisor. And incidentally, science in its widest sense, so including social sciences, humanities and so on, chief research and evidence advisor, if you like. That's quite a useful person to know. But you can begin to see who are the people you're trying to get hold of. And indeed, right at the bottom, there are contact forms. There are ways of getting hold of people. And that was just that department. That's true of all departments. But there are other things you can do. So a lot of people engage, at least initially, by looking at a consultation. This is where government is actually trying to solicit information and evidence. And the good thing about that is they've asked for it. They actually want it. They're actually hoping that you're going to engage with them. And indeed, there is a page where all the consultations are. And you can then search by keyword. You can search by different government departments. So you can see what's going on in your area. And as I said, this part of the government's website is actually quite good. And with a little bit of practice and navigation, you can see the kind of things that would be useful. So I'm just going to go out of that for now. So here's some of the things you can do. You can certainly find names. You can certainly find the names of people and the names of the organisations in which they work. You can find announcements, you can find news, you can find responsibilities, you can find addresses and email addresses. Consultations, policies. UK embassies is another useful tip. So quite a lot of people approach us and say, I'm trying to do something to produce evidence that might be useful to the government of India or the government of Turkey or Vietnam or whatever it happens to be. And strangely enough, we don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of every government department in every country. But the British embassies in those countries are often quite helpful. If you email them and say, I've got some research, I'm looking for a relevant person in the Department of Agriculture, say, who might be interested in this area, quite often you'll get a reply. And quite often they're interested because when the British embassy can be useful in a non-controversial way, that looks good overseas. So it's in their interests to promote the research you're doing and to make a helpful comment. So again, if you can have all these slides, of course, but there is a list of all embassies, and we have them in a lot of places, as you can see. So fairly easy to find your way around. Say if the moment we wanted to do something in India, all sorts of information. Again, it starts with the advice about people trying to do trade or business with India, but scroll towards the bottom and there's all sorts of things there. And that's the one you want, British Embassy or High Commission, right at the bottom. So that tells you who they are and where they are. So that's the government side. And the government, of course, are the primary people that we're trying to influence quite often because they're the people who are making decisions. But you've also got Parliament. And Parliament are often a little bit easier to engage with Parliament are not actually making decisions. Parliament are scrutinising the government, holding the government to account. And as such, they're often quite interested in hearing about expertise, hearing about evidence. One of the things they do is to produce reports, and quite often people are quoted by name, by affiliation in those reports. And that is a useful piece of impact evidence for those of you who are desperately trying to gather impact evidence, aren't we all? So how do we deal with that? Parliament includes all these different things, and I'm really apologise if you're a Parliament expert, just switch off for a second or so, but it's probably worth explaining what some of these things are in case you're not. So in government, in Parliament, there are select committees. In the House of Commons, the lower chamber, there is a select committee that mirrors every different government department. So we have the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. That's a committee for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And its primary job is to scrutinise the work of that department, but also to look more generally about issues in that area. And then there are some cross-cutting select committees. The most useful of us for universities is usually the Science and Technology Committee, but there are many others as well. In the House of Lords, our upper chamber, they have a number of other select committees. They don't mirror exactly government departments because that's done in the Commons, but again they have a number of cross-cutting commissions, such as EU Affairs, which has been quite busy recently, as you can imagine. So they run all the time. Select committees are permanently there. Then you have bill committees. So when a new Act of Parliament, a new law is being debated, for a short period of time, as it's going through the House of Commons or the House of Lords, there's a bill committee. And those people are interested specifically in that bill, which means they're not interested in the general aspects. They're interested in what does your evidence tell you about this clause, what specifically in this law that we're creating is important or not important from the evidence. So if you happen to be working in an area that's absolutely smack in the centre of a piece of legislation, that can be really, really helpful. But what they really want from you at that stage is what your evidence tells them about line 3 or paragraph 5, and not what it tells you in general terms, because it's gone beyond that. They're actually developing law at that stage. And those committees only last for as long as the law is formed, and then they dissolve again. Then you have all-party parliamentary groups. These are general interest groups, and they cover a whole range of different interests. They are not officially scrutinising the work of Parliament, of government, but they're a group of MPs and Lords who are really interested in the topic. And it's actually quite a good way to get an early piece of research considered and thought about. This isn't, oh, government department, you're not doing something right. It's, hey, Parliament, you should think about encouraging the government to look at this because this is new and this is developing. And they have an all-party parliamentary group for pretty much every country in the world, but many, many different topics, many, many different areas. Anything from cancer to electric vehicles to beer to golf. And I mentioned golf slightly ironically, but some of our researchers are speaking tomorrow at the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Golf because they have research about the health benefits of taking up golf in older age. So even though golf seems a slightly weird thing for parliamentarians to be worried about, it is an area that we can interact with them on. Individual MPs, we all have an MP because we all live in the UK. Your local MP really only wants to talk to you about local issues, things that affect you as a constituent. But you can find MPs who are interested in certain topics and contact them individually. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in a minute. There are libraries in the House of Commons, the House of Lords. They are also trying to get evidence, trying to brief their members on issues, and they often interact with academics. But they usually want stuff really quickly. So if you're on their list, they'll phone you up and they'll want something that day. That's not quite the same interaction as we have with other things. And finally, there is this lovely organisation called the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, has an acronym POST. They actually know all of the people above, and they work specifically with universities to try and make some of those links and to join some of that up. So again, the Parliament website, it's not bad. And there are various things you can do. So if we were to think we want to work with a select committee, there you go, get rid of that. There's a list of them here. And you can find out the different committees, what they're doing, what their inquiries are, and so on. And the same is true, there you go, select committees. The same is true of all of these other things. So I mentioned all party parliamentary groups. This is an incredibly long list of all party parliamentary groups, and you can see, as well as every country, there's one for beards, one for best Brexit, good luck for that. But, you know, chemical industry or choice at the end of life, you can see that they're quite specific, but you might well have a piece of research that really links in with those. Some of these all-party parliamentary groups have a secretariat that's provided externally to Parliament, often by a special interest group. So the all-party parliamentary group on homelessness, for example, has a secretariat provided by Crisis, who are a homelessness charity. And they think it's in their interests to do that, to get MPs together to talk about that particular issue. And the good thing about that is you can approach Crisis and talk to them about evidence that you have and use them as a way of interacting with Parliament. I think we've probably seen enough all-party parliamentary groups, but there are many of them. And you can go through all of these different things. The one thing it's worth thinking about is Hansard. Hansard is the list of, or the encyclopedia, I guess, of every word that's spoken in Parliament. So if you're researching a rather specific area, you can do a Google search and find out who's been talking about it in Parliament. And that could be in the chamber, that could be in one of the committees or whatever. It's all listed there. So if you're trying to find out which members of Parliament are interested in your area, that's another way. It's a kind of it's the Wikipedia, if you like. It's a very big hit, but nonetheless, it's a way of finding people. And buried in, and not very, very far in the parliamentary website, you can find, again, contact details of all MPs, contact details of committee clerks, contact details for all party parliamentary groups. So it's not a bad website to get to know as you're thinking about what you're trying to do. And that's Hansard for you. So we could search Hansard for cancer, and it's told me I've got too many results. Yes, loads of stuff, people saying stuff about cancer in the last few days. Local government. Now, local government is good and bad. It's right here. You won't be in competition with many other universities to engage with local government. Local government are often very, very busy, and actually in recent years have concentrated primarily on delivering services. So their time to step back and think about policy issues is a little bit diminished. I can also tell you that I don't recommend that you look at local government websites. They're very good if you want services. If you want to know what days the bin man comes round, they're great. But they're a nightmare to find who's responsible for what within local government. So you will get a slide. The links on this page will at least tell you to the list of councillors responsible. But actually, if you really want to talk about local government and what they're doing, come and speak to us, because we've got a few more links in there, and you'll just kill yourself going around their websites. It's not a fun experience. But there are things that are really good to do with local government. They are thinking practically about delivering services. These are the people who deliver adult social care. These are the people who deliver education in the area. Many of you will know that the air quality, for example, in Southampton is really poor, and a consultation closed yesterday or the day before about that. So the university's experts in air quality have been working with the City Council, thinking about the issues and what to do afterwards. So there are things that you can do with local government. And then we think about internationally. And again, you have two different sides of the international coin. You've got international organisations themselves, the EU, the OECD, the United Nations, and all of its different agencies. And you've got other countries of different types. And again, there are many different mailing lists that you can sign up to find out what's going on. Some of these organisations are relatively easy to engage. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. We're certainly happy in public policy to have a chat through with you about the ones that we know about. Usually for other countries, the best route that we found is to go through the British embassies, which is what I said earlier. But if, for example, you want to interact with the OECD, we have some contacts there. If you want to interact with the EU, we have some contacts there. The good thing about being a university is that we also know other people in this university who have contacts. So I don't know anybody in the World Health Organization, but I know 3 people in this university who do. And if you come to me and ask me about a contact in WHO, I can make that link for you. So there's a lot of expertise in the university, and hopefully we can share that as we go forward. So you've worked out in exercise 1 what the policy decision you want changed is. You've now got 5 minutes between the two of you to work out who's responsible for that policy, what those stakeholders are. Are they local? Are they national? Are they international? How would you go about finding them, given what I've just said? So another 5 minutes. Off you go. Okay, that's great. So in the first exercise, you worked out what the evidence you had and what policy that might be. And in this exercise, you've now worked out who you might need to speak to about that, who might be interested in that. Third bit is actually about how to have that conversation. How do we influence policymakers? Because they're different to researchers. They have different drivers, they have different thought processes, they live in a different environment. So we need to think like a policymaker, which means we need to find a policymaker. So this is a leaflet from the 1990s Department of Trade and Industry. Let's pick this chap here. He looks young and enthusiastic. He's a policymaker. I like his tie as well. Yeah, that was me many years ago. So what is that policymaker thinking? Let's think now. We are sat in the Department of Doing Good. What is he thinking? Is he thinking that? I hope we get some great academic evidence. No, that's not actually what he's thinking. So let's try and get the motivations of this policymaker. He's thinking about a number of different things. He will have a problem, he will have an issue, he'll have a policy he's working on. And here are some of the questions that he's asking himself. Is it affordable? Taking a certain action, can we do that? But affordable links with value for money. Not just do we have the money at all, but is the actual result you get from taking this action worth that money? Is it legal? That's an interesting question. The government, of course, can take new legislation through the House of Parliament, but new legislation takes a year, can be very politically difficult, and is just a pain in the neck. So if you can take forward a problem with the powers you already have, that's actually much more convenient. So he's thinking about, is it legal? Does it require legislation? Will it actually work? That's one of those great things, because quite often we will go with one piece of evidence which will help the consideration of a policy. But of course there are many aspects to a policy. And and whether this piece of evidence tells you everything, whether this will actually do the job, and will it do the job in the time available? So there are silly examples, but you hear sometimes of people engaging with government saying, I've got the answer to your problem, it's just that it'll take 5 years and it'll cost £20 million. Well, then it's not the answer to the problem because it's too long and it's too expensive. But one of the things that he's thinking about that we really don't think about at all is, will doing this thing mess up something else? Because so much of policy is interconnected. So many of the things that we deliver to the public are linked together that you might solve one problem at the expense of something else. In which case, again, it's not the right answer, or at least it needs a discussion to balance out the advantages of doing one thing versus the advantages of doing another. So what you conclude from this is that this poor guy over here has got a lot on his mind and is actually going to be thinking about all these things when he's engaging with you. So you need to plan. You need to plan the conversation, you need to plan the interaction. But the key thing is know what you want that person to do. Because again, I've seen loads of examples of people writing off saying, I've got some great evidence, here it is. And you haven't asked them to do anything with it. You haven't asked them to do anything. And so they go, thank you. And that's the end of the conversation. So know before you start what it is you want them to do. And that might be to change the world, but it's equally likely to be you want them to tell you who they should speak to next, to discuss with you how useful that would be within a policy context. But go in knowing what your ask is. Get your evidence ready and prepare it in a way that is easy to read with takeaway messages. There's something we call a policy brief, which is usually 1 or 2 pages. In fact, there's another course on that in the course of this term. But it's a different style of writing from an academic style. In fact, it's almost everything you've learned about academic writing, it's the other way round. So you start with, why should you care about what I'm going to tell you? And then you tell them the answer. And then you give them a little bit about the headlines. And don't be tempted to write any methodology. Don't be tempted to write any footnotes. Don't be tempted to write a bibliography. None of those are needed. And it ends up being very short. And it's a different way of writing. But prepare what you're going to do. The other thing just to bear in mind is quite a lot of project-funded research like to have what they call a policy or a stakeholder workshop at the end. It depends on your results as to whether that's useful in policy terms. If you're recommending something that doesn't require a decision with money, but is more about best practice, and the decision is taken at a wide level, then that can be quite good. So if, for example, you've got research on nursing practice and you've identified a way of changing things that would help in some way the outcomes for patients, but it doesn't require new money, it just requires people to do things in a different way. And nursing is something that is sort of decided on a hospital by hospital basis, then it's useful. But if you're trying to persuade a civil servant or a policy maker that they need to do something, that they need to spend more money, that they need to change what they're doing, they're unlikely to open out to you in a big stakeholder meeting that has lots of academics, that has lots of business, that has people from other sides. So quite often it's better to get them in a room, in a small room by themselves, and explain what some of those results are. And in a perfect world, you'd have planned all of that when you started the project. You'll have actually thought about that in your Pathways to Impact statement and know that you're going to be engaging people in that way. So it depends what kind of results you've got, but don't assume that you can have a big jamboree at the end, invite stakeholders, and they're suddenly going to go, ha, got the answer now, thanks guys, and go off and change things, because it doesn't work like that. And do personalise what you do. Don't send round mass emails. It's much better to have 3 really targeted emails than 50 that just go all over the place and that are ignored, because 3 people can really change things if it's the right 3 people and if it's the right message. So be ready to set your evidence in a wider context. We're thinking about this, but actually the people you're talking to have got all of these different things that they're thinking about. It's all of those thought bubbles that that poor little civil servant was mulling over. So be ready to have that conversation with him. Be ready to think about the wider context. Find a hook, find something that you think they're interested in. If you can refer to a government document that they're likely to know about, if you can refer to a recent article, something that speaks to their language, that always helps. Of course, listen as well as talk. You're trying to have an interaction, not a transmission. One of the things I always do is I try not to leave any meeting without asking the person that I've just spoken to, who should I talk to next? Who's the next person in this journey? And that is quite a simple ask. You know, they don't have to go to a lot of trouble. They can just give you a name and hopefully a way of contacting that person. But it allows you to follow up and not come out of a meeting and think, well, that was a nice conversation, but I don't know what I'm going to do. There's nothing come out of it yet. So those are just some hints and tips. It will take several conversations. You don't go in once, say, I've got the answer to cancer, or I've got the answer to, I don't know, motorway overcrowding, or whatever it happens to be. Give them some evidence, walk away, and it changes. It doesn't work like that, of course. You build up your contacts, you build up your expertise. People know you as a reliable person, and then things start to happen. Now, what I've just said assumes that you've got a direct approach, assumes that you've found a person in a government department that you can go to. And if you have, great. And it doesn't matter how you got there. If you've got a direct approach, take it. Sometimes that can be difficult. So here are some other alternatives or add-ons. We talked a little bit about these. Consultations and calls for evidence from government. In themselves, they aren't going to completely change things. But if you have answered a consultation, keep a copy and try to engage the department afterwards and say, I know you're interested in this because you had a consultation and I responded to it. And here's a copy, by the way, and let's talk about something we could do. So it's another useful way of demonstrating that you're serious and that you're interested in. Parliamentary select committees are a good way. They are there to scrutinise the work of government, so you can talk to them and through them get government interested in what it is that you're trying to do. We talked a little bit about all-party parliamentary groups and about MPs. Again, your local MP really is only for issues related to your local environment, unless it happens to be that your local MP is the person who really bangs on about ovarian cancer or road haulage or whatever it is that you're an expert on. But you can find a local MP who's interested in those things. And the last thing is intermediaries. So we don't spend our life actually trying to influence government. We spend our life trying to teach and do research. But there are people who do spend their lives trying to influence government. And these are NGOs, typically. And they're often single-issue NGOs. And they're very good at what they do. And as you can see, they're very experienced at campaigning. They've got a lot of contacts in government. Many of them are seeking evidence because they want to keep making that argument back to government. So they're quite keen. So all of those are good. And there are some examples here, Crisis, Friends of the Earth, and so on. But they do have their own agenda. And you may find that they're presenting their argument using your evidence rather than presenting your argument using their evidence. And equally, when they present their argument, they're not necessarily, even if they're presenting your argument using your evidence, they're going to badge it under their name rather than yours, possibly. So you can have a big effect with them, but there are some risks and downsides. And it's a little bit, it's not a risk, but it's a different type of interaction that you can have with them. So this is your last exercise. You've worked out what the policy issues are. You've worked out who to engage. So your exercise now is to start to think about how you're going to have that conversation. What material you're going to prepare, whether you've got a front door into talking to them or whether you need to try a side door approach. And most importantly, from my perspective, what are you going to ask them to do? So don't finish the exercise without knowing at least what are you going to ask the first person you speak to do, because that starts you off on the process. So another 5 minutes and then we'll wrap up after that. Thank you very much, ladies and gents. So we just basically come to the end. A few final thoughts from me. This whole process takes time. So it isn't something that you can just switch on. It isn't something that you just do the impacty bit at the end of a grant for a week and then go off and get another grant. It doesn't work like that. You actually have to build up your contacts and do these things over time. One person leads to another person. You'll have to have several conversations. A quick plug for the Public Policy Unit. We are a centrally funded unit covering the whole university. I'll be around for a few minutes, as will Urena at the back, so do come and talk to us today. Send us an email if you want to follow up on any of the things we've been talking about. But we're here as a source of information for you and advice, and we'd love to help you take some of these things forward. Just for information, we've got some other training sessions throughout the rest of the term, and we tend to repeat these next term as well. So if the dates don't match or if they're already booked up full, then do come back on another day. And finally, again, a bit of a plug, and you'll get this presentation. Public Policy Southampton runs a sort of a membership. These are just people across the university who want to hear about what's going on. We have a monthly newsletter. That monthly newsletter tells you about different things going on in government, sort of placement opportunities we've discovered, various different things going on. So do register with us and then you'll be on the mailing list for that. And it'd be great to talk to some of you afterwards if you want to talk to me. And that's the end, so thank you very much.